Hi everyone, welcome to Biogeography Week 10. We're going to be talking about island biogeography this week, but I wanted to quickly just give you a couple of updates. We got your midterm grades back to you. Still working through the grades for other assignments. I'm realizing that the videos that I had for the last lecture haven't posted yet, so I'm going to be working the rest of the day to get everything up to date. A couple of you all asked about reflections and questions of the week this week, but we didn't have any for last week. And we didn't have any podcasts or readings for last week that would have reflections due. So that was to give you all a little bit of an assignment break after the midterm. So anyway, I'm going to get the videos for last week's lecture posted so you can watch those and kind of supplement the material there. We're going to do this lecture today, and I'll post and have an announcement about the podcasts and reflections for everyone. Okay, so running a little bit behind, which is to be expected, during these times, but we're going to get caught up, and things will be clear in terms of when everything is due. Okay, so just bear with me, and we'll get everything straight moving forward. Okay, so today we wanted to talk about island biogeography. So we're kind of moving through these different biogeographic principles, and island biogeography is one of the most important aspects of biogeography. It's actually the method with which many of the theories within biogeography were formulated. Here's a photo of two incredible sets of islands, the Palm Island and the World Island, which are human-constructed structures out in the ocean. And you can watch videos on how these structures were built, but really interesting stuff. So the question is, why study islands in the first place, right? If scientists are trying to understand, the patterns of biology, why things exist where they do, then why islands? Why are islands such an important geographic feature? Well, the answer to that is they are essentially spatial and temporal natural experiments, right? There are areas where really interesting things are happening in relative isolation, and it's easier to understand the patterns of life that we see because there are more factors that are controlled. And so when we think about Darwin and we think about Wallace, and this is a picture of Wallace on top as an older man, and then, of course, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, the theory of natural selection by evolution was developed by studying islands, by studying these natural, temporal, and spatial experiments. So islands are a really great place to understand the evolutionary process in a way that you are not as able, it's not as clear, or at least it wasn't to folks who were developing these theories in the 19th century on larger bodies of land. Okay, so there's a lot of unique creatures, unique organisms on islands. So there's it's a great source of biological novelty, biologically new things, or at least new to the humans that are exploring them. So that's another advantage of studying islands, and that many islands have less access to less impacts from humans, and particularly human beings who are practicing colonialism or settler colonialism. Those groups of people tend to really change landscapes pretty dramatically, whereas indigenous people don't have as much of an impact. And so islands, particularly if they're isolated, are limiting in humans' impact of changing the environments very drastically. And so there's, again, a lot of ways for scientists to study the factors and the things that lead to new organism formation and evolutionary process. So the two scientists who are credited with developing the theory of island biogeography are MacArthur and Wilson. Some of you may recognize the person on the right as Edward O. Wilson. He's a very famous biologist, studied ants, but also worked with MacArthur in their younger days to develop this theory. And the reason why there's just a black and white, I just have a black and white photo of MacArthur, is that he died relatively young. I think he was maybe in his 40s when he passed away. And E.O. Wilson is actually still alive. He's in his 90s, I believe, emeritus faculty at Harvard University. So all you have to do is look up E.O. Wilson, and lots of things will pop out. And I'll have a video profiling him posted to eCampus. Okay, and so the two of them developed the equilibrium theory of island biogeography. And so, we've talked about why islands are important, but we also have to deal with the definition of what is an island. And when we think about what an island is, we tend to think of a relatively small terrestrial body in the middle of some aquatic area. So we can think of like Hawaii as an island, Puerto Rico as an island, Cuba as an island, even Australia or Tasmania as an island. But islands don't necessarily have to be bodies of land surrounded by bodies of water. They just can be isolated areas where the environment that one is looking at is surrounded by a very different environment. And so there can be marine islands. And marine islands could be a coral reef, right? A specific habitat that's surrounded by maybe open ocean or a different type of aquatic habitat. So, MacArthur and Wilson studied terrestrial islands, but just know that an island doesn't necessarily have to be land surrounded by water. It can just be an isolated environment surrounded by a different environment. Okay, so there are three principles to the equilibrium theory of biogeography, and these are really important. And so we're going to talk about them here and then look at a graphical representation of what these three principles state. Okay, so you're going to want to spend some time sort of thinking through this carefully, and oftentimes students don't really pick all of this up at once, so just be patient with yourself in understanding these three principles. They're straightforward, but thinking about them from multiple different angles is going to be the important thing. Okay, so the three primary principles of island biogeography. First is that species richness and species area, you saw those two thumbs up, which means species richness is directly related to species area. Okay, so another way to think about this is as the area of an island increases, right, thumbs up, so do the number of species or species richness also increases. And that's pretty intuitive, right? The more space you have in an area, the more room there is for different numbers of species. Okay? So that's the first principle of island biogeography. As area increases, so does the number of species on an island. All right? The next principle has an inverse relationship. So that means as one of these things is increasing, the other is moving in the opposite direction. The other is decreasing. And so species richness and island isolation are inversely related, right? So as an island becomes more isolated, relatively more isolated, or the more isolated an island, the fewer number of species there are in general, right? And so we can think about this in comparison, in comparing two islands, all right? So if we compare the island or the main island of Hawaii, which is very isolated, right? It's in the middle, quite literally in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we look at the number of species on that island, and then we compare the number of species on Hawaii to the number of species on Puerto Rico, which is an island that's much closer to the mainland. It's much less isolated. We would expect to see that there would be more species on an island that's less isolated, that's closer to the mainland. And that's because it's easier for species from the mainland to travel to Puerto Rico and colonize and establish themselves there than it would be for species to make it all the way out to Hawaii from either North America or from East Asia. Okay, so that's the second principle of island biogeography. The more isolated an island is, the fewer number of species we would expect to see there. Okay, all right. And so the last principle of the equilibrium theory of island biogeography is that species turnover, right? So the dying off of species and the immigration of species, that's what species turnover means, is a product of immigration and extinction, right? And so that's another fairly intuitive way of thinking about things, right? And so the more species, the higher the rates of immigration to an island and the higher the rates of extinction, we would expect species turnover to be very quick. And if you've ever worked in a restaurant, you might recognize the term turnover, right? Being the speed at which people leave tables and new people are seated. Okay. And so, on a really busy night when you have lots of people coming into a restaurant, you might expect the turnover of tables, right? The leaving of old guests and the seating of new guests to be pretty high, right? Because the immigration rate of guests coming to your restaurant is fast. And hopefully, if you want to be making money that night on a busy night, then you need to get people out relatively quickly, right? Okay. And so those are the three principles of the equilibrium theory of biogeography. They're relatively straightforward, all right? But one of the things that really allowed MacArthur and Wilson to sort of garner a lot of recognition was that they were able to represent these principles graphically on a graph, okay? And so I'm going to put up the graph now, and it's a bit complex, but it's important to spend some time with this and think about it. And once you do, you'll see that it is relatively straightforward, if not a little bit kind of confusing at the outset. Okay, so the first thing you want to pay attention to is the x-axis, this bottom black line here, which represents increasing species richness. So as we move from the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph, we get a higher number of species, okay? And there's multiple curves here, all right? And we can see that the blue line curves represent distance from the mainland, and the green line curves represent the size of an island, all right? And so this green curve represents the first equilibrium principle, right? Small islands versus large islands, island area. And the blue line represents isolation, close to the mainland and far from the mainland. All right? So we sort of oriented ourselves to the axis and what that means and what these two curves mean. So the next thing that I want you all to pay attention to is the fact that the curve for close to the mainland, all right, is always above the curve for far from the mainland, all right? And that represents the first principle of island biogeography, that we see that the line that's close to the mainland is always higher than the line, or always above the line far from the mainland, all right? And we see small islands being above the large island curve, okay? So the next, oops, sorry, went backwards. Okay. So the next thing to pay attention to is the fact that of these intersection lines, these nodes of intersection. And what you want to do is look at the farthest nodes of intersection and compare those two, right? So with this node here, all right, all the way to the right, it's the intersection between large island and close to the mainland. And you see that relative to these other points here, this node is farther along the x-axis than all the other ones, all right? So that means that a large island that's close to the mainland has a higher number of species, right? Because it's farther along on the right side, farther along on the right along the x-axis, will always have a higher number of species compared to this other node here on the left, which is an island that is far from the mainland and small. Okay? Now, these two nodes in the middle aren't always they're not always one is farther along in terms of species richness than the other, right? So that means that an island that's small and close to the mainland, this node here at the top, may or may not have more species than an island that is large and far from the mainland, but it depends on that relative isolation and that relative size. Okay, so the important thing to pay attention to from this graph is the x-axis increasing in species richness and the labels on these curves, okay, and then where those curves intersect. So we would expect lots of species, or the most number of species, on a large island that's close to the mainland, and we would expect the fewest number of species on a small island that's far from the mainland, okay? So that's bringing those two principles together. Now, the last thing is looking at the rate of colonization, which are these blue curves, right? And then the rate of extinction. Okay? And so the rate or probability of colonization, this curve, this blue curve, is always going to be higher than islands that are far from the mainland. And that makes sense. If an island is close to the mainland, then there's a higher probability of species colonizing that island as opposed to far from the mainland. So this is talking about the comparison, or an example would be the comparison between Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is close to the mainland, so the rate or probability of colonization of Puerto Rico is always going to be higher than Hawaii, which is far from the mainland. Okay, so that's what these two relative curves mean. Now, with the rate or probability of extinction on an island, okay, we can see that small islands, the rate of extinction or the probability of extinction is always going to be higher on small islands as opposed to a large island. And the reason for that is because with small islands, there's less space. There are fewer niches available compared to a large island. And so we would expect that small islands would be more of a sink habitat than a large island. There's just more space. There's more spots for species to fit in on large islands than there are on small islands. Okay, so that was a lot. And this graph is complex. There's a lot that's going on here. Okay, so spend some time replaying this section of the lecture and understanding and trying to understand these different principles. It's a lot to represent in a graph, but just remember that these principles are pretty straightforward and pretty intuitive, right? Again, we would expect more species on a large island than a small island. We would expect more species on a close island than a far island, and that the larger the island is, the lower the rate of extinction, and the closer an island is, the higher the rate of colonization. Okay? So these things are fairly intuitive, but it'll take some time to get these things all together in your mind. All right? Okay. So moving on to talk about more island biogeographic principles, we can talk about endemism. All right? And I'm sure you all have heard this phrase, something is endemic to an area. All right? And to be endemic is to be located where you evolved, right? And usually found nowhere else. And there are some really interesting species, some unique species that are endemic to certain geographies. And one example would be the Komodo dragon, right? The Komodo dragon is endemic to an area of the world in Southeast Asia called Komodo. And there's several islands that the Komodo dragon inhabits, but we don't find Komodo dragons living under conditions outside of humanity anywhere else in the world. You know, you can't go to Australia and find Komodo dragons. You can't go to Kansas and find Komodo dragons. They are only found, unless humans remove them from this environment, on the island of Komodo. All right, and so endemic species tend to be more prevalent on islands. And this is because of one of the principles that we talked about with island biogeography, and that there are islands in general, is that they are sites of natural experiments, right? And because they are isolated from other environments, from larger environments, there's all sorts of interesting evolutionary things that happen on islands. And so we expect to see more unique species, a higher number of unique species on islands than we do on mainlands, okay, because of that isolation. All right, so that's why. All right, so there are two more principles in terms of endemic species that we have to talk about in terms of islands and island biogeography. All right, so these are in addition to the three principles of island biogeography that were developed by MacArthur and Wilson. All right, but these are specific to endemic species, these species that we find nowhere else than their environments. Okay, so the number of endemic species increases with isolation. All right. So, we talked about the island chain of Hawaii. We would expect those islands, because they are isolated, to have fewer number of overall species as compared to Puerto Rico. But because Hawaii is isolated, we would expect a larger percentage of the species on Hawaii to be endemic than maybe Puerto Rico, simply because of isolation, right? All right. So another way to think about this is that Hawaii compared to Puerto Rico may have 100. Let's say Hawaii has 100 overall different species. All right. And Puerto Rico has 1,000 species. But on Hawaii, of those 100 species, we might expect to see 90% of them to be endemic, whereas in Puerto Rico, we would see maybe 15% or 20% of those species to be endemic. Okay? So even though islands that are more isolated, we would expect to see fewer species, we expect those species that we do see to be to have a higher rate of an endemism, or for more of them, or a larger percentage of them, to be endemic. All right. So the number of endemic species increases with island isolation, and it increases with island area. All right. So we would expect a small isolated island, to have fewer endemic species than a large isolated island would have. Okay? And in this case, the island area and the number of endemic species is the same relationship as the number of species overall in terms of area. Okay? All right. So now we can talk about a little bit more complex principle, the insular distribution function. Okay, and that's a fancy way of saying or describing a model for species richness as it relates to island isolation. Okay, so species persistence is dependent on immigration rate exceeding extinction rate. All right, so that means that in order for a species to remain on an island, the rate of that same species coming to an island has to be higher than the extinction rate of an island, the extinction rate of the species on that island. Okay, and that makes sense from a sink habitat standpoint, right? In order for there to be water remaining in the bowl or in the sink, the rate of water going into the bowl has to be higher than the rate of water leaving the bowl. Okay. And the same with species. If it's going to persist on an island, then there have to be more of those same member of species coming to the island than those dying off. Okay, so how can this happen? How can the persistence of a species on an island be relatively higher? Well, if the source population is relatively close, right? So if an island is closer to the mainland, if the island is a relatively large island, right? So we're going back to these principles of island biogeography. And another thing that aids in the persistence of a species on an island is that though that species has a high dispersal ability. And that means it's able to travel, right? It's able to cross barriers that are in between the island and the mainland. Okay, so we can think about organisms that fly. Organisms that fly have a very high dispersal ability. So we can think about Darwin's finches or any flying organism. It's going to have a relatively higher terrestrial dispersal ability than non-flying organisms. All right. So the end result of this insular distribution function, or this principle, looks something like this. Okay, and it's not important for you all to understand exactly all of what's going on, except the trend of the minimum. This line, this black line here, represents the minimum area to maintain a species with island isolation. All right, and so what that means is, as an island on the x-axis becomes more isolated, in order for that island, that isolated island, to hold species, the area has to increase. Okay, right? If that island is going to maintain those species. Okay, so again, these are all talking about these principles of island biogeography. If an island is relatively close to the mainland, then its area doesn't have to be as large to maintain its species, to maintain species persistence, as an island that is more isolated needs to be in order to maintain the same number of species. Okay? All right. So when we think about extinctions on an island, those extinctions are not always predictable, right? There are things that can happen that are not expected or that are not able to be foreseen. But extinctions, while they may not be predictable, they're almost never random unless there is some natural disaster. And we know that natural disasters occur very rarely. And so there are different characteristics of species that increase its risk to extinction. Okay? And the first is the species having a narrow niche, right? Having a narrow set of requirements and a very narrow role within an environment increases its risk of extinction. And so I have a picture here of a young child looking at a Brussels sprout and thinking, oh, this doesn't really taste good. And so that's an example of an organism that, let's say, is a picky eater, right? Only eats one thing or a few things. Having a narrow diet and therefore a narrow niche increases a species' extinction risk, because if that one food source goes away, then they're in trouble. Okay, so we can think of anteaters that primarily eat ants and termites, and ants and termites are not really in any risk of going extinct. But if there was a really deadly fungus or a pandemic of ants and termites, well, anteaters would be in trouble. Okay, and so I also have a video here that I would play in class, which is of Bear Grylls. I don't know if you all know who he is. He's a survival sort of TV host. And he got famous for, putting himself in these survival situations and attempting to show people how to survive. And he did so by eating a whole bunch of things that many of us would consider really disgusting. But the point is, there in a survival situation, and oftentimes at people who found themselves in desperate situations in survival, one of the things that allowed them to live, to make it to the next day, to be found, was the fact that they were willing to do things, willing to eat things, willing to drink things that, under more normal conditions they wouldn't, but it was really important for their survival, right? And so, that would drive the point home that, if you're going to survive as an individual or as a species, you need to be able to have a variety of resources that you can pull from. Okay. Another characteristic that increases a species' risk of extinction is slow reproduction. All right. So if you're having babies if it takes a long time for you as a species to reproduce the next generation, then that leaves you vulnerable and leaves your offspring vulnerable, more vulnerable to extinction. And this is a picture of an alpine salamander. And these alpine salamanders give live birth. And the gestation period for these salamanders is over 2 years. Okay. And so you can imagine that, if you are growing the next generation in your own body for 2 years, there's lots of things that can happen to you within that time period. And particularly if the females are lost and during that gestation period, then that's an entire next generation lost. Okay. So slow reproduction is another characteristic that makes species more vulnerable to extinction. And the last is one that we've talked about, being non-volant or not able to fly. Okay, if you've taken Spanish or know a bit of Spanish, the Spanish verb for to fly is volar. So non-volant organisms. If you're not able to fly, then it's more difficult for you to get away from different factors in a terrestrial environment than if you're not able to fly, right? So we can think about forest fires that are happening right now in the United States, in the western part of the United States. And, we think about like a condor or an eagle that's able to fly really long distances in a relatively short period of time versus, a black bear or a mule deer that would have to run across the landscape, right? They are more vulnerable to harm in those situations than an organism that can fly, right? So not being able to fly increases your risk of extinction. All right? And so when we think about those characteristics that make species more vulnerable to extinction, we can think about generalists, right? The classification of species that are relatively quick to breed, eat a lot of different things, use a lot of different resources, and are able to move across the landscape very quickly, right? So generalists that breed quicker are better suited for survival in new environments. And we're talking about islands and colonizing islands. Then generalists tend to do better. So some examples of generalist organisms that many of you all are probably familiar with or have seen: cockroaches, right? Cockroaches were here before human beings, long before human beings came, and they'll be here long after human beings have gone extinct. And part of the reason is because they are generalists. They eat almost anything. Many species of them can fly. They're highly adaptable, and they are difficult to kill. They reproduce really quickly as well. Okay, so that's a generalist species. Another generalist species, you all, I'm sure, have seen these birds. These are house sparrows or sparrows. And you'll find this exact same species literally all over the world. And one reason is because they reproduce relatively quickly and they eat a variety of different food sources, right? And they're highly adaptable. Another generalist species is a puma or a mountain lion. And before European colonization, mountain lions used to be all over North America and South America. And they're still found in many different places. Some of you all may have seen that video of a hiker in Utah who had the misfortune of running across a pair of mountain lion cubs and thought they were bobcats at first. So he approached them and then realized that they were not bobcat cubs and they were in fact mountain lion cubs, and then mama showed up. So if you haven't seen this video, I will post that to eCampus so you can see that. But this hiker was very fortunate that he was not killed by the mother. But he had to endure 6 minutes of being followed by this mountain lion on the trail because the mountain lion mama wanted to chase him away from her babies. But he had to walk backwards for 6 minutes facing this mountain lion, because if he had turned his back, she would have attacked. If he tried to crouch and pick up a rock and throw it at her, she would have attacked. So it's a pretty harrowing video. But it's a good reminder that these organisms used to be all over the place, and that they are still present on the landscape. So pumas and cougars are generalists. Another example of a generalist in an aquatic environment is the orca. We find orcas all across the globe. And they are carnivorous, but they eat all sorts of marine life, from fish to mammals, and a bunch of different things. And so they're really successful because they have a very wide niche. Okay, so we can think about islands versus the mainland, and that ecologically similar species are usually not found together between islands and mainlands. And that's because when a species colonize an island, and over time they tend to change, just like Darwin's finches, right? On the Galapagos Islands. The finch species that we see on the Galapagos Islands are not ecologically similar to the finch species that are found on the mainland in South America. And one of the reasons for this is that when species colonize an island, there's this thing called ecological release that often happens. And so that means that species that colonize an island usually are subject to different pressures, and oftentimes they don't have competitors, and so their populations increase relative to their mainland populations or their home populations. And because there are oftentimes different resources and different evolutionary pressures, those species tend to change in different ways. So over time, we see differences between island species and mainland species. Okay, and again, another aquatic example of this, of ecological release, are Asian carp in the Mississippi watershed and the Great Lakes region of North America. These are fish that were brought over from East Asia, released into the waterways, and they are experiencing ecological release. They don't have competitors. They don't have predators past a certain stage, and because they grow really quickly and because they eat a lot of different things, they are really successful. And so here's a picture of people on a boat hitting these fish, because when Asian carp are startled, one of their defense mechanisms is to jump out of the water. So you can look at videos of Asian carp jumping out of the water in response to the vibrations of a motorboat. And they can be quite dangerous, actually. These fish can grow to be 20 pounds, 30 pounds. And you can imagine if you get hit by the 25-pound fish in the head, it can do some serious damage. But also people have made a sport out of it by, whacking these fish and catching these fish as they jump out of the water. Okay? So with ecological release, we see this process over time, that species are free to occupy additional niches or new niches that they weren't before. Asian carp haven't really changed much since they were introduced, at least physiologically, because they were introduced relatively soon, relatively recently in the past. And so these changes in species usually take thousands of years or hundreds of years before we're able to observe differences in the physiology. But like I said, an example of ecological release would be the finch species on the Galapagos Islands, right? And here's a map, or here's a schematic of them. The original founding population at the bottom of this graph, and then we can see that over time we get all of these different beak sizes and colorations, because of the new niches that were available to this founding population. So we've got grainivores, ground finches that eat seeds, and we can see that their beaks, for the most part, become thicker and larger. And then we have the insectivore finches, these finches that feed on insects, and they tend to be smaller and have sort of narrower beaks. Okay, so the finches are the end result of ecological release. And this process of evolving into these different species is what happens with ecological release. If you've ever watched the show Lost, this is a sort of a science fiction example of ecological release, right? These people who are on a plane that crashed onto a mysterious island, and they begin to take on new characteristics, not new personalities, but more, I guess, of their personalities are revealed, but they are somewhat different people in this experience. I never finished watching the show because I thought it was kind of ridiculous, but it was really popular. So that's a really great way, I think, to think about ecological release and what happens on these island environments. Okay, so we can also talk about speciation on islands and what leads to the evolution of species, right? So evolvability, or the ability of a species to evolve into different forms, right? So what helps species evolve at a faster rate? Well, first, it would be short generation times, right? So the opposite of the alpine salamander would be reproducing relatively quickly. And so we can think about microorganisms like bacteria. And one of the reasons why antibiotic resistant bacteria are such a concern is because bacteria reproduce really quickly. And so if you're reproducing really quickly, you're talking about a more rapid rate of evolution. Okay. If you are reproducing quickly, but also if you are reproducing many different organisms, right? So the time it takes for you to reproduce increases evolvability, but the number of offspring that you have per generation also increases evolvability, because those are the number of new combinations that you're releasing into the next generation. And then the last characteristic is high mutation rates, right? We know that mutation is the source material of all evolution, of all changing allele frequencies within a population. And so if you have a high mutation rate, then you're going to lead to that will lead to a higher rate of evolution. Okay, so we mentioned founder effect, and the speciation of an organism, or of a source population into many different ones, is always impacted by the founders, right? You can only evolve from your ancestors' genetic source material, right? And so the genetic diversity and trajectory depends on the first individuals in a new area. So we can think about all of the different species of cichlids that we see in the African Great Lakes. And the founder effect would be the fact that all of these species are cichlids, right? The first founders of these environments were cichlids. They were the most successful. And so the reason why there's so many different species of cichlids in the African Great Lakes and not so many different species of different fish classes is because those founders were all cichlids. And so, there's a tremendous amount of variety that's there, but they're all kind of based on this same basic body type and body features and physiological features because of the founders. And the same with the finches on the Galapagos Islands. They're all finches because the highly successful founders of bird founders of those islands were finches. Okay, so that's founder effect. Okay. And so we can think about the evolutionary consequences of island environments. And we know that, insular islands, or islands that are isolated, tend to change species in very interesting ways. And I put change in quotation marks just to sort of denote that there's no sort of consciousness in this change, but change is the result, right? And so there are a couple of general trends that are present with island species. And so one of those trends, or one of those results in population, is that island species become super generalists, right? And so we can think about this with the fact of, coming to an island from the mainland where you had to really compete for a whole bunch of resources. And maybe as a mainland species, you were only able to eat like one or two things, okay? But you really wished that you could eat, the berries at the top of the tree and the worms in the fertile soil there. But there were other competitors on the mainland that prevented you from eating that. But then you get to an island and you don't have those competitors. And then you can eat the berries at the top of the trees and the worms in the fertile soil. And so you eventually evolve to be a super generalist. You just eat everything. You You are adapted to so many different environment or so many different niches in your island environment because you don't have competition, or maybe you don't have predators. So that's one trend that we can see on islands, that species become super generalists. They just sort of occupy lots of different niches. Another example is that we get relationships of unusual pollinators. And most pollinators of flowering plants tend to be insects, and certainly other organisms that fly. But on an island situation, there may not be flying organisms that are suitable to the plant species that are there. And so unusual pollinators, non-volant, non-bird, non-insect pollinators evolve. And I'll show you an example of that. And then the third trend is ecological naivete. And we see this cropping up a lot with species who encounter humans on islands and are not adapted to interacting with humans, or maybe some other predator. And so they don't know to be afraid of human beings that might consume them, and they never experienced a predator. And so over time, it can have some really deleterious effects on those species if they're exposed to a predator that consumes them. And so new environments, new ecological relationships, and new pressures, or the absence of pressures, result in a bunch of different characteristics that evolve. I have this show poster up here. At some point in my teaching career, this was relevant. This show, Earth 2, that came out in 1994. But many of you all probably weren't even alive in 1994. This is the same year that the first Jurassic Park movie came out. And so I was really excited. If you haven't guessed by now, I'm a big science fiction nerd. And so I was really excited about this show because it was a show about some human beings from Earth who had traveled to a far distant place, and they had colonized a new planet, and there are all sorts of relationships and interesting things that happen in this space. So Earth 2, this time we are the aliens. So it was a show on NBC back in the mid 90s. It didn't last very long. It actually wasn't that good of a show, but the topic was really interesting. Okay, so again, this theme of science fiction and islands and what happens with different populations on islands over time is a common theme in science fiction. Okay, so an example of a super generalist would be a pollinating organism like a bee, which not only doesn't necessarily specialize on one flower, but has evolved to pollinate many different species of flowers. So this would be an example of a super generalist. An example of an unusual pollinator, this is a fig plant on an island in the South Pacific. And the only organism that's present on that island that's able to pollinate this plant species is this gecko. And it's very rare to see a non-volant organism be a pollinator for plant species. Okay, and so this is another thing that can happen on islands that we wouldn't normally see elsewhere. And the reason why you normally don't see non-flying organisms pollinating plant species is because flying organisms are so much better at it than non-flying organisms. They're able to travel to a bunch of different flowers and pollinate many more plants than one that has to sort of move along the ground or along the trees. Okay, but this is something that can happen. And then ecological naivete, the classic example of the dodo. And the dodo coexisted with human species for thousands of years, but it was European colonizers that facilitated the extinction of the dodo. And that was primarily because, folks traveling on those ships, coming to these islands and seeing these really large birds that were not afraid of human beings and hadn't evolved to be afraid of human beings were over-harvested and eventually went extinct. But they're a classic example of ecological naivete. All right. So, this is sort of coming to an end. We can think about flight, dispersal, and defense of organisms. And so oftentimes what can happen with a species that's flying, if it comes to an island or an isolated place and there's ecological release, there's fewer or no competitors or predators that are present, species can often lose the ability to fly and potential defenses and their dispersal ability. Right. And so, the analogy of that would be, you've had it rough in one area. You've always had to fight. You've always had to flee. You've always had to be able to get out of Dodge pretty quickly. But then you come to a different area and it's comfortable and there's plenty to eat and there's not people sort of picking at you and everything. And so you tend to relax. You tend to, let down your defenses. And this can happen over evolutionary time, where organisms that had the ability to fly or had the ability to fight or had different defenses no longer produce those defenses, right? So here's an example of a weta, which is a large cricket, and there are lots of different species of weta that are present in the sort of South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand area. And, over time, these organisms grew to be really large, and they lost the ability to fly and a lot of their sort of armor because they didn't need to have those things. Flying, the ability to fly requires a lot of energy. Growing spines or maybe producing poison requires a lot of energy. And so when you don't need those things anymore, you can devote that energy to other things. And in this case of the founders of the weta, populations, they put that energy to growing really big. But they're able to do that because they don't have those predators. They don't have a need for defense, right? So these things are energetically expensive. And so when you don't have to spend, energy in that way, you can put it towards other things. So why spend the energy? And then we can think about size of organisms. And when we think about islands, and particularly isolated islands, for mammals that colonize those islands, mammals tend to get larger over time, or they tend to shrink over time. And with hominid species, it was Homo erectus that colonized different islands, but in the South Pacific, for some reason, hominids got smaller over time. And so this is the skull of an extinct hominid species. The skull that this Homo sapien is holding is actually the skull of a fully grown hominid, Homo floresiensis. And so over time, our common ancestor of Homo erectus, which was about the size of modern day human beings, over time it became smaller on these particular islands in what's now considered Southeast Asia. And so mammals, tend to shrink over time, or they tend to get really big over time. And so the direction of that body size change, depends on, the original size of the colonizing population. We can imagine that, a large band of hominids that colonized an island would probably tend to those organisms, over time, those hominids shrinking in size because there's likely fewer resources on an island habitat. Okay, but it may be that maybe only one or two or three or just a couple of organisms colonize an area, and there's lots of resources available, and so we could see mammal species growing really big. There are some really large rodents that are endemic to islands that came over as smaller organisms, but then they get really, really big because of ecological release, because of the fact that there's a lot of resources available and fewer predators, just like the weta. Okay. So another trend is that relatively large organisms, when they colonize islands, tend to get small, and relatively small organisms tend to get large, right? And this has to do with the interactions of other species and that influence the trends on those islands. So, why might the size of individuals change? Well, we sort of talked about that, right? There's different opportunities for them There may be a large increase in resource availability and niche availability, or they may be more constrained on islands. And so the size change is always relative to the environments that's there. Komodo dragons, the ancestral population of Komodo dragons, were smaller than what present day Komodo dragons are. And in this case, a monitor species that came to these islands was able to take advantage of the resources that were available, and where growing big was advantageous as opposed to staying small. And so overall the trend in reptiles, whether or not large becomes small and small becomes large, is not always as clear. And so that has to do with different ecological features of island habitats, and what is the source genetic material of those organisms coming to the island. Okay, so that's all we have for this week in terms of island biogeography. This week you do have a question of the week, and that question is, why are there no primate species endemic to North America? Right? Why did no primates evolve, so far as we know? Why did no primate species evolve in North America? Okay, so that's the question of the week. And there's no right answer or no wrong answer in this case, but I want you to kind of speculate, because we're going to be talking about geographic diversity and the great biotic interchange of North American and South American species. So a couple of reminders for this week. There's 2 podcasts to listen to that will be posted, and that there will be reflections due. But instead of those reflections being due on Sunday, this coming Sunday, they'll be due at the end of next week, so the Friday, November 6th. Okay, and I will change that in the schedule so that will be clear, and also indicate the due date on the Dropbox on eCampus. All right, so there's 2 podcasts to listen to. They're really cool, really interesting. I think you'll enjoy them. So those reflections will be due a week from this coming Friday. All right, so you have plenty of time to sort of catch up and get things done before there. Also a reminder to please come to office hours. Again, office hours are every Wednesday from 1:30 to 2:30. There is a Zoom link on eCampus for that for those office hours, so please take advantage of that. If you want to talk about midterm exams and ask some questions about that, please come to office hours every Wednesday. And then, of course, you can always email me to schedule an appointment to come and talk about those things. All right? Okay, so I hope you all are having a good week, and that you continue to have a good week. I know, things continue to be really challenging, and as we see the numbers of COVID cases increasing quite a bit, just a reminder to be safe, to take care of each other, to check on each other, and please communicate with me just via email, and let me know if there are things going on that are preventing you from getting work done, and I'll be in touch in a relatively quick period of time to sort of work with you on those things. Okay? All right. Oh, and lastly, please go and exercise your right to vote. It's really important to participate. Not advocating for any particular party or any particular candidate, but it's just important that we all participate in the process if we feel that that's something that's important, and it is important if you're willing and able. So please get out and vote. Participate in what's going on in politically in the country, because it affects your lives. Okay? All right. Talk to you all next week.